Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to come talk to y'all. It's a great group of people, not just at eScience, but across the whole campus. And I've had a wonderful time kind of sitting in and having meetings. So I'm super excited to be talking to you about my work at the intersection of cognitive science and data science. So within cognitive science, I am specifically interested in looking at communication. And I think that communication is really vitally important because it's one of our most essential human characteristics. It supports and defines our experience. Almost everything we do, from negotiating peace treaties to buying a cup of coffee, it's all marked by our ability to communicate and interact with others. And what I think is one of the most fascinating parts about human communication is just how flexible and adaptive it is. So we use communication to build rapport with one another, to build ties to each other, whether this is something simple like having small talk and meeting a new person, or using communication to build deeper bonds with those we love. We can use it to build bridges across to one another. We can also use communication to achieve shared goals or to engage in joint action. And that could be something as simple and mundane as cooking a meal together to something much more intellectually complex, like writing a journal article together. And while we have these friendly and collaborative activities, we can also use that same communication to engage in conflict, to express our differing views with one another and fight about things that we really hold deeply. And what I think is so interesting about these different areas, whether we're having a friendly conversation or working together or having an argument, we're using the same behavioral channels. We're using emotion, we're using language, movement, gesture, but they're all defined by unique dynamics. So whether we're engaged in each of these different kinds of communication shapes the way that our different patterns of language kind of reflect those larger goals. And so what I'm really interested in doing is understanding how we can take a data-rich perspective to quantify interpersonal dynamics both in the lab and in the wild. What I think is really important is that we take the rich opportunities that we have for communication in any behavior, whether it's language or emotion or movement, and understand how we can treat those as rich time series and understand how those ripple and unfold. And I think one of the best ways that we can do that, in my personal theoretical perspective, is by understanding communication as a complex system. So what this kind of idea is that you have, in any complex system, you have independent agents who are interacting in these local, self-organized, simple behaviors in a changing local environment, and together that creates this emergent behavior, this complex adaptive behavior. And probably the most iconic way that you can think about this is in the butterfly effect, where one butterfly flapping its wings can create a tornado or a hurricane across the globe, and that's showing how these very simple relationships can ripple into these much larger behaviors. And so I think we can take this and very fruitfully adapt it to understanding communication. So the independent agents who are interacting might be the interlocutors or the individuals who are engaging in communication. Their simple, self-organized local relationships that they're holding, that might be the individual behaviors that they're engaged in, whether that's a single emotion or a single gesture or a single word. And they're engaging in those local behaviors in this changing environment, this context. And that can be anything from the physical environment in which we're engaging in interaction, the noise level around us, all the way up to the higher level social goals that we have, whether we're trying to work together on something or have an argument. And together, these pressures create this emergent property of interpersonal dynamics. And I think that what is really fruitful here is instead of viewing communication as this linearly additive process, where we think of two people as being individual, distinct entities that just kind of add together to make a communication. This takes a different view of communication, where we look at these different pressures that can create different dynamics depending on what's happening. And so I think that the benefit of bringing data science into this perspective is that when we view communication in this way, a data-intensive approach will help us understand how context shapes these interpersonal dynamics and outcomes. Although you can approach this from any perspective, context is my most interested area in this whole scheme, understanding how the changing context shapes these different behaviors. So today I'm going to talk about a few things. I'm going to be talking first about new methods, new data-rich methods to quantify interpersonal interaction in the lab. And then I'm going to talk about using an emerging approach to understand interpersonal dynamics in the wild. So I think these are very important complementary aspects of understanding human communication, because if we take seriously that communication is a dynamical system, is a complex adaptive system, then the context, whether that's in the lab or out in the real world, can have a real effect. So what I think that we can learn from data science in this way is taking advantage of a broader view of data, not just data as being this traditional lab-generated data, but looking to big data, naturally occurring data sources to understand the way that we interact in a broader context. And then finally, I'm going to talk about my work that's going on with growing open science and big data and cognitive science, and then I'll close with some future directions where I think that data science can help inform cognitive science more broadly. First study I'm going to be talking about is looking at how interpersonal dynamics can adapt to simultaneous perturbations at multiple scales. So as I mentioned before, different kinds of behaviors can emerge as dynamics from interaction. And one of the ways that I'm most interested in studying these dynamics is through this idea of interpersonal coordination. And this is the idea that individuals, as a result of their interaction, will become more similar over time. This is also known as something called mimicry or alignment or convergence. And essentially, it's just saying that the more we interact, the more similar we become. And this has been documented in a number of different specific behaviors. So for instance, when we're interacting, we become more similar in our movement patterns. This is everything from just the overall amount, amplitude, volubility of our movement, all the way up to what gestures we're using, what meaningful movement, and our posture and the way we're holding ourselves. Even something as low level as our postural sway, the tiny micro movements that we make to keep ourselves standing, become more similar when we're interacting with one another. We also see that individuals become more similar in their speech patterns. This is everything from the statistical structure of your speech, what sentence constructions you choose to use, all the way down to the individual phonemes, the way that we pronounce words become more similar as a result of our interaction. And even something that we see as intensely personal, like emotion, can become more similar over time, where interacting with others, we have this emotional contagion that we feel what the other is feeling. So while we know that coordination happens across all of these different behaviors, one open question is what the functional role that coordination plays would be. There are currently two perspectives on this. One, that coordination is largely affiliative, that it exists to build bonds between people, that it's a rapport-building mechanism. And the other is that coordination is adaptive, that it can help change the way that it can adapt in the response to these contextual pressures to help us communicate more effectively. And there is work to suggest that coordination is indeed adaptive across contexts. So for instance, we see that social breaches will decrease as a result of the movement coordination between people. This can be something as kind of loud as having an argument, where if people are engaged in an argument, their overall movement coordination will decrease compared to when they're having a friendly conversation, even to something as seemingly trivial as breaking a social norm, like showing up late to an experiment. So that's kind of at the higher level, but we also see that this happens at a lower level, where if you're having a conversation in the context of loud traffic noise, you will start to move your head in more similar patterns to your partner than if you're having a conversation in an otherwise silent room. So this is suggesting that coordination is indeed adaptive across these different contexts, both what we might call adapting to high-level demands, so the social structure or the social context, and the low-level demands, or the more perceptual pressures on the interaction. But to date, there hasn't been much work looking at how these influence each other. And that's what we wanted to do by looking at this study, to see how low-level demands and high-level demands interact, to see how they adapt, how coordination will adapt to these different contexts. So to do this, we wanted to study communication in the lab in a natural setting. So we brought in 21 undergraduate dyads, and before they met their partner, most of them didn't know one another, we had them individually complete opinion surveys on socio-political issues. So this is everything from gay marriage to legalization of marijuana to the death penalty to abortion. And we asked them to write in a few sentences and a few lines, as you can see here, what their opinion was in their own words. And then we asked them to rate on a 1 to 4 scale how strongly they held that opinion. So that gave us both a sense of how they themselves thought of it subjectively and how they would objectively quantify the strength of that opinion. So after they completed these surveys, they handed them over to the experimenter. The experimenter said, great, okay, I've got to go outside, I've got to finish some last-minute paperwork. Why don't you go ahead and sit down, introduce each other, and get going? So while they were kind of breaking the ice, because again, most of them were strangers, the experimenter went out and compared their surveys to find topics on which both partners had written differing opinions, but both held strongly. So when the experimenter came back in the room, both of the participants were outfitted with a Google Glass that was running a data collection and stimulus presentation software that I'll talk about in just a second. And then they were assigned to have 2 conversations. One was a friendly conversation or an affiliative conversation where they were asked to talk about entertainment and media that they both enjoyed, to find something that they both liked, and to talk about why they liked it. And this was meant to help build those bonds between them and build that rapport. In the other conversation, participants were asked to have an argument that was founded on those topics that had been identified from the surveys that they disagreed on but both held strongly. And they were, both conversations were about 8 minutes long, and they were wearing the Google Glass. So while they were having these arguments, all of the participants saw in the little screen on their Google Glass, they saw a flashing red and blue light. And this was our low-level perceptual perturbation. Just like the previous studies have found that the increased noise level and auditory occurred in the environment led to increased coordination, we wanted to see if perhaps that same effect might hold when individuals are having a conversation in the presence of visual noise. So what we did is we randomly assigned half of the dyads to a dual task condition, which was we told the participants to remember the number of times the screen turned red, and that they would be asked to record that number at the end of the conversation. And so this induces a working memory load on the participants during this conversation, which has been believed to be a coordination breaking effect, that the more working memory load you place on people, the less that they will coordinate. So we wanted to compare that to the noise condition, which is when we just told the participants, okay, you're going to see this flashing red and blue light. That's just a bug in the programming. You can ignore it. So that allowed the participants to kind of simulate the auditory noise in the environment, that uninformative signal, just like the traffic noise would in the auditory condition. So we had these 2 different demands on them, the high level and the low level, like we mentioned earlier. So the high level demand was the conversation, argument and affiliative conversation. Again, all dyads participated in the affiliative and the argumentative conversations. And the other was the low level demands, where they were either told to remember the red boxes or they were told to ignore the red boxes. And what we expected based on previous work is that we would see the highest amount of similarity of head movement in the participants who were engaged in the affiliative conversation and were assigned to the noise condition, because they would get the coordination boosting effects of both friendly conversation and the noise. By contrast, we expected that we would see the lowest amount of coordination in the arguments for dyads who were engaged in that working memory task, that dual task that was supposed to help break coordination. And then the other 2 we expected would be somewhere in the middle, getting 1 positive and 1 negative from the high level and low level demands each. So as I mentioned before, we used Google Glass to help induce these low-level pressures. So what we did is we took the Google Glass, which, if you're not familiar with it, this is a wearable technology that's worn on the face like glasses. There's a small screen over the right eye, as you can see here in the image, and then along the right temple, there's an onboard computer that includes an onboard accelerometer. So we programmed an app for Google Glass that would talk to what we call an experimenter console, which allowed participants to have this wireless experience of having the information, the little red and blue flashes, communicating to a remote server that would record their movement and allow the experimenter to have moment-to-moment control over what the participants were seeing and also just information about how the conversation was going in real time. So to kind of give you a feel of what this would be like if you were participating, let's say that you're sitting and having a conversation with your conversation partner. The majority of and you're wearing Google Glass, the majority of your visual field is unoccluded, and up in the top corner you have this small, mostly see-through, semi-opaque box that would be what you're seeing for this screen. So we programmed the Google Glass to, at a rate of 1 hertz, generate randomly a red or a blue screen with a 90% chance of turning blue and a 10% chance of turning red at each time step. So this, again, induced the low-level constraint where either the dual task condition, they saw the same exact thing as the noise condition. It just mattered what they were doing with that signal, either ignoring it in the noise condition or remembering it in the dual task condition. So while you're having your conversation and seeing the flashing light, the glass is collecting your movement along the XYZ accelerometer axes. And here's kind of an example of the data that we get. This is just 5 seconds of data, and each axis is plotted in its own color. So we get this really rich time series where it's sampled at about 250 hertz or once every 4 milliseconds. So we get this really rich time series from each participant who's wearing the Google Glass. And so, as I mentioned before, I really think this is a way that we can highlight how important this data-rich perspective is to understanding dynamical systems theory, specifically in cognitive science more generally. So for dynamical systems theory, we really need these high-frequency signals to help chart the way that these different behaviors unfold over time. Because we're trying to understand these rich perspectives, having the amount of data that something like this will generate is really beneficial to helping us understand what's going on in communication. And at the same time, being able to have these additional new tools, wearable technology and other things, we're able to integrate both stimulus presentation and data collection in real time. So when we look to other tools, new options in computer science and data science, we are able to expand our ability to get more and more rich information about communication. So now that we have the 2 time series, as I mentioned, the one from each participant, what we did is we took those XYZ accelerometer series and we simply took the Euclidean distance from the origin, so we're left with 1 movement signal from each participant through the entire conversation. So to decide how to measure how people influence one another in their body movement and become more similar over time or not, we chose to use cross-recurrence quantification analysis, which is a nonlinear time series analysis. So just to kind of give you a brief introduction to what that is and how it's calculated, let's say we have 2 time series, one generated again from the head movement of each participant, one for the person who's sitting on the right hand of the screen and one for someone who's sitting on the left hand of the screen. So CRQA will take these 2 time series and it will compare the nonlinear structure and patterns in them. Now, for those of you who are familiar with cross-correlation, this is very similar. Cross-correlation will compare the similarities in the linear unfolding of these, but we get some added benefit by getting the nonlinear patterns in CRQA over cross-correlation. So to kind of make this simpler, and rather than talking about these as continuous signals, I'm just going to talk about this in the categorical case. So let's pretend that each dot is a movement occurrence by each participant. I'm happy to talk more about the way that continuous cross-occurrence is described, but this I'm hoping might make it easier for people who are less familiar with this method. So for cross-occurrence, we take these 2 time series, one for each person, and we place them along the x and y axis of a grid. And so what we're going to do is we're going to map the similarities across all of this space between the 2 participants' movement. So here along the diagonal, we have lag 0, or the line of synchrony, and that indicates where time for one person is equal to time for the other. This is this is how communication happens for all of us. Time for me right now is equal to time for you. But cross recurrence allows us to look at wider windows to see how people are influencing each other with a leading and following kind of behavior. So what we do is we take this grid and we've put a dot at every point where there's overlapping movement across both participants. And we do this completely kind of in a Cartesian product kind of way where we get all intersections of shared movement over time. So now that we have this plot, we can quantify it by looking at the percentage of points filled in at each diagonal. So we start at lag 0, and we quantify the percentage of points filling in that line, and then we go out to the corners in increasing lag to get our understanding of how the leading and following dynamics occur. So once we've calculated all of that, we can move from the recurrence plot, which is what we just created, and use that to generate what's called a diagonal recurrence profile. And this is a way that we can get handy information about a shorter time series window to look at plus or minus a few seconds to see how people are leading and following. So what we do here is we take our information, we've got recurrence rate, or the percentage of dots filling in each diagonal along the y-axis, and where we had our lag of 0 along the diagonal here, it's in the center of our diagonal recurrence profile. And what we're going to do is we're going to fill in the percentage for each lag along the recurrence rate on the y-axis and increasing lag out to the side so we can get an idea of how these behaviors unfold over time. So now that we have this, we can fit a series of polynomials to the diagonal recurrence profile to see how we can best describe it. So for instance, we can use a quadratic, we can fit an orthogonal quadratic polynomial to it to look at how peaky it is, because if people are coordinating, we would expect to see this quadratic pattern. And we can also fit a linear polynomial to it to see any leading or following behaviors. I'm not going to talk about the leading and following aspect today just for simplicity, but I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about it after. So now that you know what we're calculating and how we're calculating it, let's talk about some patterns that we could see. First, we might see here that the individuals have the highest amount of coordination at lag 0, and then it kind of drops off on either side. And that would be an indication of synchrony or coordination, that people are more moving at the same time than not moving together at the same time. Another pattern that we might see is where at lag 0, we've got this dip in coordination, or percent recurrence. And that would be an indication of asynchrony or turn-taking, where people are they're not engaging in the same behavior at the same time. And a good example of what this might look like would be something like speaking. Turns, when we're having a conversation with one another, we take turns. We say our piece, then we let another person do it. There's not a lot of talking over one another, but you do see this kind of characteristic turn-taking pattern. And the third option that we might see with this is where there's really no clear relationship between them, where there's just kind of a fuzzy line of coordination. So what we did with this, our specific analyses and hypotheses for this project, we used growth curve modeling to understand the different ways that the different polynomials, including that quadratic, that it could help get that peakedness in R. And we predicted recurrence rate in the diagonal recurrence profile with orthogonal linear lag, orthogonal polynomial lag. So again, that linear lag is a leading following. The quadratic lag is the synchrony. And it's important to note that these are orthogonal polynomials so that you can independently interpret them from one another. Then we also predicted it with task. So this is the between dyads condition. This is whether they were in the dual task condition, where they were asked to remember the red boxes, and the noise condition, where they were asked to just ignore the red boxes. And finally, we also threw into our model conversation. So this is the within dyad condition, where people were having either the friendly conversation, the affiliative conversation, or the argument. And we also included dyad and conversation order as random effects with maximal random slopes. So to kind of graphically represent what we expected from our hypotheses, these are 2 plots that are similarly set up to the ones that I showed you before, where you've got mean recurrence on the y-axis, and you've got lag along the x-axis. And here is the lag 0 for each of these 2 conditions. So we're going to have dual task condition on the left-hand side of the screen and noise condition on the right side of the screen. And the affiliative conversation is plotted in green and the argumentative in red. So if what we expect holds from these data, we would expect to see that the highest amount of coordination is in the noise condition during the affiliative conversation, because again, they get those coordination boosting effects from both of them. And then we would expect to see the lowest amount of coordination in the argumentative condition during the dual task condition, with the other 2 kind of somewhere in the middle. And again, we expect both of them, no matter what's happening, we expect to see this coordination pattern where it's kind of described by a quadratic polynomial, because head movement coordination has been shown to be coordinated just generally. So our results. This is going to be the actual plot of our actual data. So what we find, indeed, is that participants' head movements were synchronized in time overall. So people tended to be moving their head in similar times in similar ways, just generally. We also found, replicating our previous work, that coordination decreases during conflict compared to friendly conversations. So this supports our high-level contextual constraint effect. But interestingly, we found no main effect of the low-level condition, where there was no main difference between the dual task and the noise condition. But we did see sharper temporal coupling, so this sharper peak here in the dual task condition compared to the more diffuse peak that we see in the noise condition. So this is just kind of a brief overview of the main points from the model, but I'm happy to discuss in more depth as well. So taking away from this, this is what we expected to find. And we kind of were able to support that with some caveats. So we do see, again, that argument as a high-level demand on the conversation does disrupt interpersonal coordination. But interestingly, we find that the low-level demands, that whether someone's engaged in a noisy environment or in a dual task working memory load environment, will shape the temporal dynamics, not overall, just the temporal dynamics of the interpersonal coordination. And this is something that would have been difficult, if not impossible, to uncover if we didn't have these very rich methods for extracting these reliable quantitative signals from conversation. So when we look at how these interact with one another and their effects on coordination, this suggests that coordination might be that more compensatory view of coordination, where coordination can help compensate for these noisy communication signals that are disrupted in other ways, even as it adapts to other higher level contextual factors. So that was the first study. So the takeaways from this, why I think it's important for cognitive science, it highlights my view of why cognitive science and data science are so important together. This shows the importance of data-rich methods in really driving home some of the important theoretical points that we want to be able to make as cognitive scientists. So moving on to study number 2, and with this one again, this is looking at naturally occurring data moving outside the lab and into the wild. And we're looking here at how language and personal traits can affect persuasion in real-world contexts. So when we look at persuasion, there are a number of factors that we think from a variety of fields, from political science to linguistics and psychology and beyond, that could affect how persuasive someone is perceived by their audience. So we might see that we know that negativity can help sway especially undecided voters. We know that hedging, saying words like may or might or could, can help opinions seem more reasonable and more palatable to an audience, especially if they're more extreme opinions. First-person plural pronouns, words like we and our, can help build rapport between a speaker and an audience. And attractiveness, in analyses of real-world voting data, attractiveness can give up to a 20% boost in votes. And finally, framing can help change the perception and evaluation of your message by the audience. So framing is the way that you are couching your argument. It's not what you're saying, it's the way that you're approaching it. And the same message put in different lights or framed in different ways can have significant effects on the way that you are perceived, that your message is perceived by others. And while all of these different effects have been shown in individual studies, it's difficult to conceive of a way that we could create a standard psychology experiment in the lab that would allow us to adequately vary all of these in a way that wouldn't be rather unwieldy. But that's the beauty of naturally occurring data sets. So if you get the right naturally occurring data set, we can have these new opportunities to explore the way that these complex, multidimensional issues unfold in the real world. So in our case, we're going to be looking at how naturally occurring data sets can help us look at how these different factors influence persuasion. So to do this, we put together a corpus of transcripts from the Intelligence Squared US debate series. So this is an Oxford-style debate program that is often aired on NPR, so some people might have heard this. And essentially, what an Oxford-style debate is, it means that instead of debating a question, you're debating a motion. So this is something that is posed in the form of a statement. So for instance, ban college football. This is putting your topic not as a question but as a statement. And so your debate teams who are debating one another for this, they are either for the motion or they're against the motion. So we have these approximately 105-minute long debates with equal teams of 2 to 3 debaters on each side. And so the corpus altogether is over 900,000 words with about 300 unique debaters and almost 70 debates. So one thing that I think that this corpus can really highlight is how we can think of naturally occurring data as being useful to cognitive scientists. But one question that I often get from cognitive scientists who are thinking about this issue and are kind of grappling with it is how naturally occurring data can fit with our traditional models and ideas of what makes a good psychology experiment. So one way that I like to think of naturally occurring data is as these kind of 4 V's that IBM made popular with their description of any big data set. And although they were, again, created to apply to big data, I think we can use them to evaluate naturally occurring data sets as well. So these 4 V's are volume, or how much data you have, variety, or how many different sources of data you have contributing to your data set, velocity, or how quickly you can aggregate and process your data, and finally veracity, or the degree to which your data are representing what you think they represent. So when I think about this in terms of cognitive science, I think that we can make an easy case that a lot of these plug into issues that cognitive scientists and psychologists are already worried about. So volume, for instance, is sample size, making sure you have enough participants in your experiment to make the inferences you want to make. The velocity might be the research pipeline, or making sure that you can iterate over your theoretical questions, collect data, and get through that research pipeline quickly to make your arguments. Variety is convergent validity, or making sure that you see the same effect across multiple areas. And finally, veracity is clearly an extension of external validity, or making sure that your study is actually capturing the psychological phenomena that you think that you're capturing. And so I think that this is really important when we just take a simple reframing of these kinds of concerns. We can talk more openly to the domain scientists that we think could really benefit from using data scientific perspectives. And so building back to why I think that this element of data science is so important to what I study as a dynamical systems theorist, this really drives home that we can study interpersonal dynamics not just by collecting these data in the lab, but by getting large data sets, again, at this high resolution that's required to understand the unfolding dynamics in these new and rich ways that would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to study or replicate in the lab. So this is the argument for this, under this perspective, is that you're using these kinds of naturally occurring data sets as a tool for theory building. You're not just going out and finding any data set, you're finding a data set that's rich in the areas you need it to be rich in order to make the important theoretical perspectives that you want to make. So now that we have our corpus, the way that we went about operationalizing all of our variables, we took framing as whether the debater was for or against the motion. Again, because this is an Oxford-style debate where everything was posed in the form of a question, we very easily and naturally had this measure of whether someone was being framed as having a positive message by being for something or a negative message by being against something. And this had no impact on their actual beliefs. Someone having banned college football could just as easily have been college football is an American tradition. So being for or against, again, this is the framing of the argument, not the content that's in it. For persuasion, we took advantage of a very interesting and amazing aspect of this data set. So before these debates were all held in front of a live audience. And the audience could vote both before and after the debaters gave their position. So we were able to get this kind of ground truth measure of persuasion for the people who were actually in the room at the time. So just to give you an example, we have, let's say we've got, again, our example, banned college football. We have a declared winner by who had the most votes at the end. So in this case, it was for the motion who won. But we can get a more nuanced picture of what the actual persuasiveness was by looking at, by taking into account the initial conditions of the audience and their perspectives. So what we did is we took the pre-debate vote results, where everyone in the audience could vote for, against, or undecided on the motion. And then we also used the post-debate vote results, where again, those same people were able to vote for, against, or undecided on the motion. And to take into account initial conditions, we created this variable called delta V, which is simply the difference in pre to post-debate results of the against group subtracted from the for group. So we have 53 minus 16 for the for, and 39 minus 53 for the against, and we end up with a delta V for this debate of 51. So delta V is the relative gains of the for group relative to the against group from the pre to post debate vote. So a higher delta V means that the for group was more persuasive, and a lower delta V means the against group was more persuasive. To capture attractiveness, we got their headshots, all the debaters' headshots from the website, because that was up there too, and we had undergraduates rate them on a 1 to 5 scale. And then we used a bag of words approach to capturing negativity, hedging words, again, that's words like may, might, or could, and first-person plural pronouns by analyzing the transcript. So what we then did is we took all of these different variables, we threw them into a linear mixed effects model where we predicted the delta V, again, relative gains of the for group to the against group, using overall winner as a maximally specified random slope, because again, we wanted to abstract as much as we could away from the initial conditions of each debate. And we predicted this delta V with all of the different variables that we mentioned before. So what we found, interestingly, was that only attractiveness reached significance in this model. So when we look at the results, here we've got attractiveness on the x-axis, delta V on the y. Again, for is more persuasive for the for group, and less is more persuasive for the against group. And the for group is plotted in red, and the for group is green, against is red. So what we see with this effect is that attractiveness doesn't play the role that we would expect it to. So previous work has found that attractive people are more persuasive, but that is not what we're finding here. Instead, we're seeing an effective framing on this, where debaters who are rated as more attractive, regardless of what group they were in, resulted in a higher delta V. In other words, if you were an attractive debater, you helped the for group win. Even if you were on the against group, you helped the for group win. So this is, again, showing that this framing effect can really change some of these effects that we have seen exist. So attractiveness helped members of the for group and hurt members of the against group. And there's a trend, but not statistically significant results, that attractiveness could even be backfiring more for the members of the against group than the members of the for group, where you've got this higher slope for the against group members relative to the for group members. And so one of the beauties of this particular data set is that Intelligence Squared US is still ongoing. So as we keep going, we can take this model and see if our results hold true in future analysis by continuing to analyze the new debates. So after that result, we wanted to look just at the linguistic signatures. As people who are interested in language and communication, we wanted to look at what might happen if we ignore the attractiveness result and we just look at the language. So to do that, we took 67 measures of language and using a bag of words approach. That's everything from the verbs they were used to how complex their language was to negativity and hedging and all of those other variables. And we took a reduced dimensionality approach by doing singular value decomposition over each vector to get a reduced dimensionality approach to understanding each person's linguistic fingerprint. And we predicted delta V, or the change in both, using these linguistic fingerprints. And even when we're just looking at these kind of reduced language, we still get an R squared of 0.13. And while that's not a terribly high R squared, when you think about the ways in which we're viewing debate is seen as an intensely cognitive activity, that it's the way that we engage in these really deep, important discussions. When you just take into account not what they're saying, but how they're saying it, you can account for 13% of the variance in the vote, which we thought was very interesting, again, showing that context can really affect these important outcomes for conversation. So we found that there were 3 of these clusters that significantly affected delta V and 2 that trended towards significance. And so each of these clusters was named by looking at the words that loaded most highly on them. So you've got the relations category, health category, social category in the significant, and the trends included an assent category, where this was essentially just words about yes, yeah, that accounted for more than half of the variance in that category, and emotion words, all emotions, positive and negative. So I'm not going to go over these in depth too much, but I just want to point out that, again, just like we saw with attractiveness, we do see this interesting framing effect where increased use of some of these words, regardless of who's using it, results in better performance for the for group, and increased use of these words in some categories leads to a better performance for the against group. Again, suggesting that it's this higher level framing effect that's interacting with successful strategies to change how the audience is viewing your performance as a persuasive individual. And so taking these kind of all together, what I think of the important takeaways from this is that we see that the complex signatures of persuasion, again, in this what we think of it as very rich intellectual activity, are sensitive to seemingly trivial contextual factors. Whether it's the cluster of language that you're using or the way that you look on stage, these are having effects on how you're being interpreted by the audience. And I think that the broader question this kind of puts out there is that these rich, naturally occurring data sets really open the door to new explorations of these very complex phenomena in ways that would be difficult, if not impossible, to study in the lab. And so, again, I really think that this highlights the utility of this approach of data science and the new perspective to cognitive science, that we can move in these new, interesting ways to make really complex arguments about how people communicate and interact in the wild. So finally, I'm going to briefly talk about about open science and big data that I'm working with, trying to help equip cognitive scientists and psychologists to take advantage of big data and help tackle important things that are going on with open science. So to do this, we created dataonthemind.org, which is a community-focused initiative aimed at helping bridge the gaps between big data and cognitive science. And I'm doing this with a number of people who are involved in this, led by Tom Griffiths. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to reach out to different people in psychology and cognitive science who think that big data sounds neat, but they don't really know where to start. And we want to really help provide that information for them. So we do this by identifying what we call 3 gaps. The first gap is the imagination gap. That's the ability for someone to see their research question in an existing data set or a big data set. Because that's one of the problems that I think isn't really well thought of, but is in fact one of the most hampering, because they think, oh, big data, I hear about this all the time, but I study categorization. How can I understand human categorization and category learning by studying Twitter? So what we want to do is put together, for this, we put together data sets that are online, mostly freely, completely openly available, And we describe what each one is by saying the name of it, what kind of data set it is, a brief description of what the data set looks like. And what we want to be able to do is provide these pointers to these data sets and repositories that could really help lead to new insights in behavior and cognition. We're specifically focusing on data sets that were not created by scientists. So we're really interested in trying to help researchers take advantage of just data that's out there, whether that's a history of all chess games played online, to understanding energy usage in West Texas. So what we do on top of that, because even though we provide all of these different data sets, someone going on there might not immediately be able to look and say, oh, well, I see immediately how that correlates to my research area. So what we do is that we take each data set and we tag it with a number of what we call applicable fields tags. So these are areas of research that are kind of at the level of an intro psych textbook, where it's not too fine-grained, but it's also not too open, so that someone can go look at all the different fields that we have represented, click on the name of whatever they study, and go look at all the data sets that we have available for them. So once they have their data in hand, the next gap that we have to tackle is the skills gap. So this is, you have your data, what do you do with it? So this is, we want to help address everything with this. We want to be able to bring together tools and tutorials that can help them make sense of the data. And we want to really help with what we call the entire data life cycle. So this is everything from acquisition to data preparation to analysis to visualization and sharing, because again, we want to help people make their data more freely available. And part of this includes also, we'll be hosting tutorials ourselves. So this summer we're going to be putting together a conference, a small workshop where we're going to, funded by the Estes Fund, where we're going to be bringing people in and recording these, making these tutorials and the associated code completely free online for people to do this, to do it along with them at home. And so finally, the last gap that we want to really help bridge is the culture gap. So this is changing the perception of big data and naturally occurring data sets in psychology. So someone who is really interested in this might say, like, this sounds great, but I don't have any role models. I don't know how other people are using this. How does it feel to actually work with big data in my research area? And what can I expect from journal reviewers who have no idea how to work with this? So what we do is we put together what we call featured projects, which are project-focused interviews with cognitive scientists who are actively engaged at the intersection of big data and cognitive science. And we really want to span, a whole bunch of different areas. We want to make sure that no matter what you study, if there is a role model already doing it, that you can go on and you can see what people have for, inspiration and tips and different perspectives. So again, our goal is to bridge the imagination, skills, and culture gap to really help cognitive scientists meet the unprecedented challenges and opportunities of big data and naturally occurring data sets. And so just kind of some broad takeaways from my work and from both as a researcher and in this domain of helping other cognitive scientists take advantage of it. I really think that there are a number of things that we can learn as cognitive scientists from data science. Number one, I think, is reproducibility in open science. I don't know if all of you have heard, but most people have, that psychology has a reproducibility crisis right now. So what we think that psychology can learn from data science is how to share your code, your data, everything, to make everything as openly available, whether it's through Open Science Framework to share your data, to GitHub to share your code, Docker to share both of them together in a completely encapsulated framework, to making living documents. These can all help provide more faith by the general public in the science that we're doing. If we make ourselves completely open and we say, you don't have to take my word for it, run these analyses yourself on this data, we can really help psychology in a really massive way. I also think that we can learn by getting a bigger and more interdisciplinary toolkit. So although we have a lot of expertise in making inference from experiments that are done in the lab, and we're great with eye tracking and mouse tracking, being able to look at more tools can really help us expand the reach of cognitive science. So this is everything from learning how to code, just basic programming, to being able to use advanced data manipulation so that you can can be able to really understand what's happening with your data and not have to work in Excel, which is, again, not reproducible. It's very difficult, to doing good data visualization and machine learning, to computer vision techniques, being able to massively increase your ability to run subjects by looking at some of these more automated and more objective techniques. And finally, the last big takeaway I think that we can learn is expanding our ideas of what counts as cognitive or social or behavioral data. So this is everything from what people think of all of the social media platforms to maybe analyzing videos on YouTube, or I just heard today about someone who wants to do some interesting Google Maps studies. Anything that humans, most of the data that's online was generated by humans doing human social cognitive behavioral things, and if we can understand how to extract the meaning from that, we're going to really advance our understanding of people. And then things like online platforms for more traditional studies, like Amazon Mechanical Turk. So taking all of this back to where I started, I really think, again, that what we need to do to better understand communication is take this more data-rich perspective to quantifying the interpersonal dynamics that we engage in both in the lab and in the wild. And I really think that the way that this really helps us move forward is that data-rich perspectives can open new opportunities to capture the dynamics of human communication and to offer new paradigms to do any theory-driven work across psychology and cognitive science. So thank you for listening, and thanks to all my collaborators and research assistants.
Anybody have any questions for Alex?
No, first of all, Alex, it's very impressive work.
Thank you.
It's very exciting. I had a number of questions. Well, I'll just focus on the first segment on the lab stuff.
Yeah.
So one thing that struck me is in the high level kinds of those influences, which had to do with the conversation, it was, although they were given sort of a general framework about something to disagree about or
Mm-hmm.
it was pretty open-ended as to what it was, the degree of disagreement, and also the points at which that was happening. And you're collecting really great detailed data on head movement, which I thought was absolutely awesome.
Thank you.
So I didn't know if you could do something that might provide a little more control. For example, if they read from scripts, and so that you could have a script that was an agreement script, the script was disagreement, it would coordinate when kinds of disagreements occurred. Anyway, just a thought about how you might get a little more control into that experiment.
Yeah, definitely. Just to repeat the question, going back to the first study about head movement coordination, while I have the data from overall the experimental conditions of having the argument or having the friendly conversation, the data that we're analyzing are throughout the entire conversation, not just studying specific moments of disagreement. And how could those data better reflect these more conversation, not the conversation level, but the turn level or smaller scale moments of agreement and disagreement? I think that's a great question. I think that is actually one of the ways that we could incorporate some more traditional methods of coordination, of social psychology in this. So if, for instance, we presented people with snippets of these conversations and asked them to rate whether people were having an argument or having a friendly conversation, then we could have those, we could have a better analysis and look at that. Your idea that you mentioned of providing people with scripts and scripting these kind of moments of agreement and disagreement, that would definitely be interesting. It would provide a slightly different paradigm in that it wouldn't be self-proposed argument, but it would still shed light on some of that, and understanding just the ways that people compose themselves when they are intending to have an argument or intending to have this friendly conversation could definitely be interesting, certainly. Thank you.
Okay, so with the DERBs, is there any way to window those so that you can see the trajectory? Like
Yes.
agreement, or taking turns and then shouting over each other, and then
Yeah, that's a great question. So question was about the cross-recurrence quantification analysis, or CRQA, looking at the diagonal recurrence profiles. So looking at whether we could, instead of looking at the entire conversation, kind of break that up into smaller windows and see what's happening over time. There is certainly a way to do that. There's actually windowed cross-recurrence quantification analysis. It's a tool where essentially, instead of looking overall at the windows, you break them up into chunks as you suggest, and you can look at trends that happen, or you can look at maybe the beginning part of every dyad, whether they're having a friendly conversation or argument, are characterized by this, and the end of the experimental session is characterized by that. Definitely an area for future directions. Again, also getting at this better idea of understanding what's happening, not just over time as kind of a bird's eye view, but getting into a little bit more of the data. Certainly. Yeah, thanks. Oh, in the back?
So, sort of more towards the end of your talk, you talked about how to bring data science into cognitive science. When I work with the psychology department here on campus, I have to say that I feel like the most resistance that I've seen to data-intensive approaches and more open, collaborative science have to do with this sort of intersection of like a resistance to culture change and sort of calcified dependence on certain sets of skills and frameworks. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on how does somebody who would like to see their colleagues and their research teams move in more open directions? How do you get people to sort of break out of their mold?
Great question. So, question from psychology perspective, seeing that in psychology departments, even if there's interest in kind of opening the doors to open science and new non-traditional ways of thinking, there's often a lot of pushback that people perceive from people who are more entrenched in traditional perspectives, and what could we do to help nudge people along and make it more open? I think that's a fantastic question. I think that some of this relates to incentive structures that are in the community, and for a long time it was more worthwhile for you to sit on your data set and just kind of make it yours and mine it forever rather than ever releasing it. I think that some of those incentives are changing, and I think that it's difficult for any one person to do anything structurally beyond making themselves, an example, to say, I believe in this and I will do it. I will release my code. I will release my data. So I think that's one thing that we can do. At a higher, more structural level, I think that one thing that is kind of happening a little bit in some journals anyway, they're requiring that you make code and data available for any publication. And I think that's fantastic. That's a way that you have to force people to be, to be engaging in open science if they want to, do what's required for jobs, for tenure, for, for promotion and things like that. And building that into the system is important. I think that what you mentioned about having this certain set of skills and certain expectations about how science should be done, I think that that's difficult as well. It's difficult because when you're just one or two people working together at these, at these problems that are approached in a certain way, it can be difficult to say, well, I think that this other area is more beneficial. I think that part of that is just making yourself known, like doing what you need to at conferences and in friendly venues to show that, and teaching undergraduates and graduate students, and basically getting anyone who thinks that this is a possibility and help train them and equip them. I know it's not a very satisfying answer because it's a very systemic problem, but I think that, many hands make light work. Maybe if we are all pushing in together, we can help change the system. So, yeah.
I think on that, we should end. That's a really great place to stop. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.